They laid Amelia to rest just after noon. By sunset, the mourners were gone. The flowers had wilted, and silence had settled in. But Ethan Caldwell remained. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He had survived sandstorms, surgeries, and 74 winters, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of goodbye. So when red and blue lights cut through the twilight, and a young officer shouted, "You're trespassing," Ethan didn't move, because to him, this wasn't trespassing. This was a battlefield of memory. This was sacred ground. Before we dive into this emotional journey, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Let's get started. Ethan Caldwell stood alone beneath the fading gold light of a Vermont autumn evening. The small cemetery on the edge of Maple Glen was nearly empty now. Just wind stirring the last of the leaves and a quiet stillness settling in like a blanket. At 74, Ethan moved slower than he used to, but his presence remained steady, built from decades of discipline, love, and unspoken pain. He wore his old navy blue suit, freshly pressed, though the collar didn't sit quite right, and the buttons strained slightly from age. A faded Air Force pin gleamed softly on his lapel, half hidden beneath the folds of his coat. Before him was the freshly carved headstone of Amelia Caldwell, his wife. His anchor, his light through the darkest years. Married for 47 of them. She had passed quietly just 3 days earlier. Now he stood in silence, a small velvet pouch clutched tightly in his hand, one she had never seen, containing a letter he had written during a lonely night in the sands of Iraq. A letter he had promised to read to her someday. Ethan hadn't planned to stay long. But goodbye is never as simple as we tell ourselves it will be. The sun had nearly dipped below the tree line when Ethan finally opened the pouch. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from memory. Inside was a folded, yellowing sheet of paper, edges frayed, ink slightly faded. He took a breath, shaky and thin, and began to read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I made it home." His voice cracked at the first line. Not loud, just above a whisper, like he was speaking to a ghost. He had written those words during a sandstorm in Iraq, tucked in the corner of a tent, unsure if the next morning would ever come. He had promised Amelia he'd share it with her one day, but there was always another excuse, another day. Now, this was the last day. He was mid-sentence when he noticed headlights crawling slowly across the gravel path. A police cruiser? Lights off, but presence unmistakable. The tires crunched to a stop a few feet from him. Ethan squinted, shielding his eyes from the glare. The officer who stepped out was young, mid-20s maybe, clean-shaven, crisp uniform, hand already near his belt. "Sir, cemetery's closed. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Ethan blinked, still holding the letter. "I'll be gone in a minute," he said gently. But the officer didn't step back. He repeated the order, this time more firmly. "City property. You're trespassing." Ethan's spine, once straight from years of service, now sagged from the weight of grief. "She was my wife," he said, voice barely a murmur. 47 years. "I'm just trying to say goodbye." It should have ended there with a nod of understanding, maybe a moment of silence, but instead, protocol took over. The officer requested identification. Ethan handed it over, calm but weary. Name, birth date, service number, everything he had once memorized like scripture. "Still," the officer stepped closer, radioing in a non-compliant subject, a term that had nothing to do with Ethan's heart, and everything to do with how slow grief makes a man move. The old man didn't resist. He didn't argue. But when the officer reached for his wrist, Something in the air shifted a tension unspoken, a memory too fresh. The first cold touch of the handcuffs around his wrist felt like betrayal, not of the law, of the promise this country had once made him. Ethan's knees buckled slightly as the cuffs clicked into place. The cold metal pressed against his skin, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. He wasn't in Vermont anymore, he was in Kuwait. In the dark, hearing the whistle of incoming fire and the panicked breath of a brother bleeding beside him. But this felt worse. This felt personal. He lowered himself slowly to a nearby bench, letter still clutched in one cuffed hand. The officer hovered, tense, unsure. "Sir, you need to come with me." "You?" "I'm not resisting," Ethan said quietly. "I'm remembering." Before the officer could respond, a sound broke the stillness, the deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow and unified. Not one pair, several. Shoes hitting pavement with a practiced rhythm that needed no introduction. The officer turned. Startled, 6 men in full dress blues were walking through the cemetery gates. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence demanded stillness. Leading them was Nathan Reyes, now 30 active-duty Marine, and a man who once sat across from Ethan at the VFW Hall in Maple Glen. When he'd received a call from a neighbor, "Something's wrong at the cemetery," he hadn't hesitated. He didn't ask for details, he just put on his uniform. The officer stiffened, unsure of what protocol said about this. Ethan turned and saw them, for the first time that day. His eyes filled with tears not from sorrow, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that he wasn't alone, that someone had remembered, that someone had come. Nathan stepped forward, slow and steady, stopping just short of the cruiser. He didn't glare, didn't threaten. His voice was calm, but heavy. "What's the charge, officer?" The young cop swallowed hard. "Trespassing. Refusing to leave after hours." Nathan looked to Ethan, then back at the officer. "Did he damage anything, threaten you?" "No, sir, but—" "Then why is he in handcuffs?" Silence fell like a weight. Behind Nathan, the other Marines stood in formation, backs straight, medals catching the last orange sliver of sun. They were not there to intimidate. They were there to testify without words what service looks like when it continues after the battlefield. Ethan sat still, but inside, something shifted. Dignity, once wrapped in silence, had found a voice. Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words, calm and measured, did more than barked orders ever could. He's 74. He buried his wife today. He sat down because he couldn't stand anymore. That's not defiance. That's grief. The young officer's grip loosened. His eyes flicked between the uniformed men and the old man seated beside the grave. Uncertainty clouded his expression now. Where minutes before there had only been protocol. Behind them, something was happening. Neighbors drawn by the tension. Veterans arriving wordlessly. A quiet crowd forming near the gates. One woman filmed with trembling hands. Another stood with a flag folded neatly in her arms. The weight of the moment had shifted. Authority no longer sat in a badge or a citation book. It stood tall in pressed uniforms and unwavering eyes. The officer hesitated, then finally said, "He's trespassing after hours." Nathan nodded, as if acknowledging the words, then stepped forward and without asking unlocked the cuffs from Ethan's wrists. "You've done enough," he said simply. The young cop opened his mouth, but one look from Nathan closed it again. There was no malice in his face, just something deeper, something like disappointment. As the cuffs dropped to the ground, Ethan massaged his wrist. The red mark there wasn't just from the metal. it was from being unseen, misunderstood, dismissed. Just then, the cemetery director burst onto the scene, out of breath, waving a clipboard. "Mr. Caldwell has written permission to remain after closing," he stammered. "It's in the funeral file. I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." No one responded right away. Nathan didn't turn to the crowd, didn't seek approval. He looked only at Ethan. "Would you like to finish your goodbye, sir?" Ethan nodded. This time, with more than tears, there was pride now. There was steadiness. One Marine handed the velvet pouch back into his hands. Another gently guided Ethan's elbow as he rose from the bench. The formation followed him not like a parade, not like soldiers, but like guardians, quietly reclaiming sacred ground. Together, they walked back toward Amelia's grave. And for the first time that evening, Ethan stood tall, not because his back didn't ache, but because someone finally saw the man he had always been. The wind had quieted by the time Ethan reached Amelia's headstone once more. The velvet pouch felt heavier now, not with weight, but with meaning. He unfolded the letter again, the one from Iraq, its creases deeper from time and tremble. This time, he read not to the wind, but to her. "I made it home." His voice shook, but it didn't break. The Marines behind him stood like sentinels, silent, respectful, a human perimeter of honor. No one moved. No one needed to. The letter carried through the air like a prayer, whispered just loud enough for heaven to hear. As the final words left Ethan's lips, something unexpected happened. One by one, strangers began stepping forward. A woman with silver hair laid fresh peonies beside the grave. A boy in a scout uniform removed his cap. A Vietnam vet with trembling hands raised his fingers to his brow in salute. It wasn't spectacle. It was sacred. Within 48 hours, the story had spread. The cell phone footage, Ethan in cuffs, the Marines arriving. The reading at sunset circulated across every major platform. News anchors debated law. Commentators argued over police training. But none of that mattered to Ethan. What mattered were the letters. Hundreds came, from widows, veterans, nurses, children. One note, written in uneven handwriting, read, "You reminded me of my dad. I miss him every day." Another said simply, "Thank you for standing up. You helped me stand, too." Ethan kept them in a shoebox beside Amelia's bedstand. Every morning, he would bring one to the cemetery, sit beside her stone, and read it aloud. "Look, Ames," he would say, "they heard us." The cemetery had changed, too. What once was routine patrol became something else entirely. Officers arrived with more than flashlights. They brought empathy. Some even stopped to say hello. A few had read about Ethan before ever meeting him. And when they finally did, they didn't say, "Step away from the grave." They said, "Good morning, sir." Ethan never sought recognition. He only ever wanted one thing: to finish the promise he made in war, in marriage, and in grief, to never let her be forgotten. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that love, like service, leaves behind more than silence. It leaves footsteps others want to follow. Ethan Caldwell had never imagined he'd become a symbol. He wasn't the type to seek attention. He had lived his life quietly, devotedly, one steady day after another. But now, when he walked through the gates of Maple Glen Cemetery, people paused. Children waved, veterans saluted, strangers offered soft nods or simply placed a hand over their heart. It wasn't celebrity, it was reverence. He visited Amelia twice a week without fail, sometimes in full suit, other days in flannel and worn loafers, depending on how much energy his aging joints would grant him. On sunny mornings, he'd bring her daisies. On rainy afternoons, just himself. and always a letter. But Ethan wasn't just grieving anymore. He was mentoring again. Young officers now sat with him on their lunch breaks, asking questions about what respect really looks like. One even asked to hear about how Amelia and he first met. Ethan laughed a full, deep sound that surprised even him, and told the story with tears in his eyes and a smile on his lips. One afternoon, a teenage girl approached him, notebook in hand. "Mr. Caldwell, can I write about you for my civics project?" she asked. He blinked, stunned. "I thought you kids wrote about presidents." She shook her head. "Not this time." That night, he wrote a new letter not to Amelia, but to the girl. Inside, he said respect isn't a thing you earn once. It's something you prove again and again, especially when nobody's watching. His life hadn't become easier. His body still ached. The nights were still quiet, and sometimes too long. But something inside had shifted like an old compass realigned. He no longer visited Amelia just to mourn. He came to share, to protect the dignity of not just one woman, but of all who loved and lost in silence. In standing his ground first by accident, then by conviction, Ethan had reminded a town of its humanity. And in return, the town held him up, not as a hero in uniform, but as something rarer, a man who loved truly, endured deeply, and still showed up even when it hurt. That was growth not taught in boot camp. That was the kind only grief, love, and years can earn. It was early November when Ethan made his final walk to the cemetery before winter truly set in. The leaves had nearly all fallen, blanketing the ground in quiet gold. He wore the same navy blue suit he'd worn at Amelia's funeral, though now it fit more comfortably. The creases from that long-ago afternoon when his hands had been cuffed. His grief misunderstood were nearly gone, but he still felt them. Under one arm, he carried a thick envelope. Inside were 7 letters, each handwritten, carefully folded, addressed to the Marines who had stood with him that day. Each one began the same way. "I didn't know if I'd ever have brothers again, until you walked through those gates." He had written each line with intention, not as a soldier, but as a man who'd been seen when it mattered most. He laid the envelope at Amelia's grave and sat beside her, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. The cemetery wasn't empty this time. A quiet hum of presence lingered. A young Marine stood a few yards back, not approaching, just keeping watch. People passed by and nodded, some recognizing Ethan, others simply sensing something sacred. The officer who had once cuffed him gone from the force. Quietly, no fanfare. Ethan had never called for punishment, only for understanding. He got both. Later that month, new training protocols were introduced in the county crisis awareness, de-escalation, senior sensitivity. Ethan never spoke at the meetings, but his name was mentioned often, usually as an example of what could go wrong when hearts aren't heard. Ethan didn't want apologies. He wanted people to remember. And they did. Local newspapers ran updates. Veterans halls invited him to speak not about combat, but about commitment. He declined most. He preferred the silence of his visits, the simplicity of one more letter, one more story whispered into the wind. Because that's what mattered, the quiet promise, the kind made beside a hospital bed, the kind made in sand-covered boots, the kind made beside a grave when no one else is watching. Ethan had not asked to become a reminder, but in holding to love, to honor, to stillness, he had reminded an entire community what those things still looked like. Not in parades, but in presence. Ethan Caldwell's story teaches us that dignity isn't defined by uniforms, medals, or laws. It's found in how we show up for each other, even in moments of silence. Especially then. He didn't shout. He didn't resist. He remembered. And in doing so, he reminded a divided world that love, Grief and honor are not just private emotions, they are public values. Sometimes, the most powerful stand is the one made without fists or flags, but with a trembling hand, a soft voice, and a heart still full of memory. What would you have done if you were there that night? Drop your thoughts in the comments we read, everyone. And if you believe honor still matters, hit subscribe and stand with us.